I'm going to carve this cherry blank. I axed it out last night, and you can see the oxidation that's taking place on the sapwood. It should be creamy white once I get down below that. Word about aprons. You can see that this apron has a knot tied in the back, because most aprons, when you get them, they're too low. And I found that the apron that was here, it would gap open and all the wood chips would spill right down it. So I think aprons that are typically as low as they are, and also aprons that have a breast pocket, it's just going to fill up with wood chips. Hi, Tom. Morning, Bob. So I'm just going to quickly carve this spoon. It's a weekend special. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to do anything fancy with it, but it's unusual for me to deliberately carve a spoon that's tangentially oriented like this, so it's a fun little treat. I don't typically do it because I don't think it's I don't know. I usually prefer when spoons don't have crazy grain, because then you focus on the form. But as always, it's useful to explore different things. Hi, Sherry. So Sherry and anyone else, if you have questions, and I'm particularly talking to Sherry because she's in this month's virtual apprenticeship challenge. If you have any further questions, Sherry, that I haven't answered yet this month, please shout it out. I thought your idea of storing blanks in water was an interesting one, and I've never tried. I think I've left billets floating in water for, I don't know, maybe a week. I've never tried doing blanks, and I've never tried leaving them for long term in water is the answer to your question. So one of the things I want you guys to notice here is how rough I'm being, how I'm not really paying attention to I'm paying a little bit of attention to the form that I penciled or that I drew with pen, but this stage of carving is not really about getting the lines perfect. It's just about hogging off the material so that you can get down closer to a point where it does make sense to pay attention to those things. This one of the reasons I usually stay away from cherry sapwood is it has a lot more moisture in it than the heartwood, and so it just feels different. It feels, and I can tell I'm not getting as clean a finish. But that's okay. By the time it's going to lose moisture fast. One of the nice things about cherry is that it loses moisture fast. So by the time I reach finishing cuts, it will have lost a lot of its moisture. And part of that is also just getting down to a more delicate form, right? So you're losing moisture not just because of the nature of the wood, but also because you get down to such a thin piece of wood that there's almost no moisture left. Hi, Jerry. If you have any questions, shout it out. Yeah. So you can see also, this sapwood is harder to carve than the heartwood. And part of that is this grain orientation also. This is something I've talked about where, because I'm diving down through growth rings. No, Jerry, it's just the cherry sapwood, and it's got these, cherry sapwood often has these, I don't know what they are, inclusions of something. They almost, I wonder if they have something to do with this. I mean, I think they are a little, have more scent than the rest of the wood, but I don't know. I don't think they necessarily serve that purpose. I think that's just coincidence. So one of the reasons I'm really pushing hard here is that the cell layers that connect one layer of growth rings to the next are more tightly bonded than the cell layers within a growth ring one to the next. So it's harder to separate one layer of growth rings from the next, which is what I'm doing as I'm carving down here. No, it's not bugs. It's like straight up part of the sapwood. It's quite beautiful. really. So at any rate, whenever you're doing tangentially oriented like this, you're diving down through the layers of growth rings, and you're going to struggle um, more with cutting across, separating those growth rings one from the next than you would be in a radially oriented spoon, where when you're carving these wide faces like this, and particularly on the back, more what you're doing is cutting one set of cells from another across a whole bunch of growth rings at once. If that makes sense. How do I feel about spalted wood? I'm not a huge fan, Sherry. I think, like anyone, I'm a bit of a sucker. When it's just right, it can be lovely. But I think that my big beef with spalted wood is that I find myself, well, A, it's weaker unless you catch it right at the perfect moment. And B, it's easy to be suckered into stopping before you really should, because the spalting is doing something awesome. And the problem is that spalting doesn't, wood darkens and grain patterns fade as the spoon ages. And so you're suckered into this sort of temporary, beautiful thing that keeps you from pushing the spoon to what it should be, because, ooh, it looks like an owl right now or something like that. You know what I mean? And when in the end, the only thing that's going to remain is going to be the form. So, I don't know. That being said, like, I was prepping some beach blanks for people the other day, and there was this like stripe of purple running through this white wood, and it was just so lovely. So I salivate like anyone else. You see something really cool happening with the grain in certain pieces, and you think, oh, I want to carve that, but it's for somebody else, so I let them carve it. So I view this stage of carving as being mostly worth the extra pain for the grain patterns. Especially if you are starting out and or struggling with cracking in the shoulders, I would say no, Jerry. I give people, when I do blanks for people, I do a certain amount of tangential, just because there's certain pieces of wood that's the only spoon you can fit in, right? So you whack up a log, a chunk of log, and yeah, Tom. If you live close to me, Tom, you would just be able to get trees yourself. So when I whack up a log, there's certain parts that make sense to have radial, but then there's other pieces, like the sort of odd little bits where you're like, ooh, instead of one spoon, I could fit two spoons in if I do this one here, if I split this piece of wood here, and then this bit on the edge can be tangential, and this bit here can be radial. You see what I'm saying? So you can end up, oh, there it is. You can end up with tangential simply as part of making best use of the log. Tom, someday you're going to come visit and you're going to have a lot of fun. Alright, so you can see at this stage, all I was doing essentially was cleaning up all the faces, getting underneath any axe marks so that I see what I have, and everything is a little more delicate so that when I go to make my next cuts, once I've redrawn the shape, everything is just easier to cut and it's easier for me to get a sweet line. But I didn't really, mess around too much with getting things perfect or even the right dimensions or anything like that. I'm just dressing up the faces so I see what I have, and I can respond to that at this point. Because if I mess around more, I'm not necessarily speeding up the process, and B, I might remove material that I would regret later on having removed. Alright, so now I'm drawing the form. Notice how my hand, this hand, so radially is kind of king of splits. Honestly, Jerry, I think the king of splits is actually halfway between radial and tangential, which is to say, when you have those spoons where it has the concentric rings on one side and it kind of radiates out, then the handle kind of acts like it's radial because the grain is running at an angle through the spoon this way. Those are the best in my mind because with those, they're actually the strongest because you have sort of sheets of grain flowing and wrapping around the spoon bowl with that orientation, and you get the beautiful, concentric circles in the bowl. But because they're offset, you don't struggle in the same way with cutting across growth rings in the same way. So, but that usually requires either wasting wood or taking wood from a very large log. So if you're tending to be carving sort of smaller diameter stuff, you're going to be doing mostly radial or tangential. I don't even know what the in-between is called. Tom, do you have any idea what that in-between split is called? Do you know what I'm talking about? What was I saying? Oh, notice how my hand is resting on my leg here. How can you achieve that split? I'm going to draw you a picture. Okay, so if this is your log, this one is tangential. So what you're seeing, this little sort of dish shape, is the cross section of the spoon bowl. That one is radial. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so then give me a second. Stand by, stand by. So it's like that one is in between. You see how it's not quite lined up like that one to be perpendicular, but it's also not quite tilted like the radial. It's halfway in between, right? If this one is the center line is there and there, this one's center line is kind of skewed like that. They're called rift cuts. Okay, cool. So, and is that, all right, why is it called a rift cut, Tom? So the other thing, and this is a little counterintuitive, I think, is when I have a spoon like this that has a lot of grain pattern going on, I have learned the hard way that it really makes a lot of sense to just keep the form completely simple, because any nuance to the form just isn't going to show up against all that grain pattern, right? Like the more I can keep the form really simple, the more you notice and appreciate the grain pattern. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So why are they called rift cuts? So now on the handle, I'm going to do the handle on the second stage, right? I've got my pencil line. And notice how my pencil line, it's a little sketchy. You can see down there, I sort of tried out a couple different lines. So I'm not trying to hit that perfect mark right off the get, and keeping my side of my hand braced on my leg, and then limiting my pencil motion to whatever the arc of my hand could be, is really allowed me to end up with this nice consistent shape. Now I'm going to do the sides of the handle first, which is different than how I normally do it at the beginning, because I want, if I'm going to hit those back shoulders, I want to do it now before I cut them again and get a nice clean line on them. Notice how I moved this down. This was too high up, and it kind of could wiggle, and that's a real danger. If this wiggled and slipped, well, then all of a sudden I've got a knife sort of jamming up towards my face. Thanks, man. So you want to make sure when you brace it, there's this spot. It's your sternum. That's right. There's like a little bit of bone, but it's possible, I think, particularly on guys, to be up too high up on your chest when you're bracing, and that's actually not safe. You want to be right in that pocket there, because the spoon can't buckle in the same way. If it's in the pocket, it won't pop free from the pocket, whereas here it could pop free. You see? One other thing that I dislike about tangentially split spoons is when you're carving down the handle, for instance, you usually end up with good lines, but because of the grain orientation, it is possible for it to split rather than cut cleanly. If you miss, right. All right, so now I'm going to carve around the shoulders. And again, tangentially split wood is less forgiving than radial in that in this bandsaw cut running around it, if you go in the wrong direction even a little bit, sometimes it can split deeper into the spoon outline than you intended, and that is less prone to happening with radially oriented, for reasons that I haven't quite articulated yet to myself. Otherwise I'd articulate them to you. So you have to make sure you're going in the right way for the grain. And actually, here's a good point. I think it's human tendency, if you find yourself going in, like making a cut in the wrong direction with the grain, I think it's pretty common human tendency to like try and resolve that cut anyways, right? You're like, oh shit, it's diving in, and you like keep pushing the cut thinking you're gonna like see what the damage is at the end of it. I think that's a mistake. I think if you notice that you are going in the wrong direction in the grain, you can stop yourself even without resolving the cut and then come back from the other direction. You will often not end up with as much damage as you would if you sort of, I don't even know why, psychologically why we do it, but right, but like that way in which you're like, oh, I'll just like finish this cut and I'll deal with the problem. But if you can stop yourself from finishing the cut in the first place, you'll have a smaller problem to deal with at the end. Do you guys know what I mean by that? Has anyone found themselves doing that, where you're like made a cut, like, oh shit, it's splitting out, but you continue to finish the cut anyways? That's where you're taking the pressure. Yeah, I guess it's that same spot, isn't it? There must be, there's probably like a very tiny niche market of like spoon carving bras that have like a little extra reinforced thing. That's hilarious. Okay, so good. And good. Right here, this is the most dangerous spot with that tear out that I was talking about. Right here are the widest parts of the bowl, because that's where the grain changes. And if you come from it from too far back, it'll want to split. but you have to kind of go in it from a little far back, otherwise you won't get a smooth curve. So there's the rub, right? All right, so now's the moment when I hold it up and I squint, and I'm going to do some fussing to try and get it as clean and symmetrical as possible. And again, going for super simple form, so that what stands out is the grain. Sherry, are you saying yep in that if there was a carving bra, you'd buy it? God, that would be hilarious. Carving bra. Mark my words, though, in the same way that, like, back when whoever the guy who started Nike, like, couldn't have anticipated all the spin-off businesses that came from making jogging a thing. I think there's nothing so far-fetched that I don't think it has the potential to happen when it comes to spoon carving as it progresses through time. All right, here's a really important point. So, if you're struggling down in the neck, say you got a little bit of tear out, it's usually a better move to come down from the handle like that, again, just a little bit, and leave it attached, and try and get as low and tight into that shoulder as you can. And this is partly why I find really tight but curved corners on those shoulders to be much easier than more broadly curved corners, because you can get down tight and then it's just a very short distance that you're trying to clean up. And you can usually do that with a very simple twist. And if, like here, it didn't quite clean up, it's just a shorter distance that you're trying to resolve compared to a broader curve. So I've found that it's actually less fussy, even though I used to think that they were more fussy, but now I think they're less fussy. Excuse me, that looks good. So I would say if you're struggling with curved shoulders and you find yourself keep going back to stop cut necks because you think that that's all that you can do, believe me, I used to be there. I used to only do stop cut necks because I felt like curved necks were neck transitions were too difficult for me. I figured that was like professional level stuff. And then I found that actually curved necks are faster and easier to get right so long as they are tightly curved, and that it's the ones that aren't tightly curved that would that seem to give me more problems. Okay, good. So now I have my outline, and I can already feel this sapwood has already lost so much moisture that it's just is not going to give me a problem. Now, I'm going to retrim the rim. And again, I'm going to come back and trim this rim one more time, so I don't need to get it perfect. I just need to get it close. That's one of the beautiful things about this process being sort of iterative, in that you sort of bring everything into more and more refinement, and the refinement happens over the course of several stages. And the fact that it happens over the course of several stages means that you don't have to get it perfect at any one stage. You just need to get it good enough that you can accurately, or as accurately as is reasonable, do the next stage. So here I am doing the top of the handle. Now, as long as I've left myself a bunch of material here, I can change the perceived amount of crank of a spoon and give it more crank or less crank by the amount that I push down this tail flip here. If I push it down more, I end up with the feeling of more crank. And if I make it more shallow, I end up with less crank. Yeah. Good, Andrea. So now I can sort of analyze how much crank I have. and also whether I need to see how that's actually, I need to take more down on this side, so that's useful for me to realize. But I can analyze how much crank I have and figure out if I want to enhance it or reduce it. And then like this line, I think is really easy to make too much. And I think the more subtle you can be, the better. That's my taste at any rate. Let's just see here. Good, good, good. Notice how I left this attached here. I did not try to go back and forth trying to clean that up, because then you'll end up overcutting right here in the neck. So you want to do it as a thumb push going down to the bowl, and then either, you know, go like that and just tear it out by hand, or leave it attached. But don't come back in this direction trying to clean it up, because you're never going to. All right, so now I'm going to pull up the side rim. At each stage, I about cut the side rim in half, and that's how I approach refinement while still giving myself wiggle room at each stage. I never want to sort of get all the way to the finished dimension too early in the game, because you never know where you're going to need to adjust later on. So at each stage, as the cuts get more and more refined, I'm pulling everything into more delicacy, but I'm doing it in stages so that I can adjust things as I go. If you don't do it that way, it's still possible that it will work out fine some of the time, but some of the time it won't work out. Whereas if you had done it the way I'm describing, you would end up with wiggle room and the ability to adjust. And that's really important. So now I'm blending the back of the bowl, but just a little bit. I always do the final stuff on the back of the bowl at the very end once I've done the inside of the bowl, particularly on eating spoons. And leaving this a little on the thick side on the bottom here just gives me some insurance. What's squinting do? Yeah. So squinting is where, if you're trying to see if it's symmetrical or not, there's two good things that I know of. You can hold it up against a window, in which case it's easy to see the symmetry, but you could also squint at it, and somehow squinting helps you kind of like focus on just the one thing and blur out your peripheral vision and focus in on the thing. So I find it helpful. It also probably looks ridiculous. All right, now at this stage, I'm going to leave this keel pretty strong. It's easy to overcut this keel on the back here because it's a very powerful cut that you're doing here. Super powerful, and it's easy to overdo it, but you need that because let's say when you're running facets down the handle, you end up taking off more than you realize, and your handle is now super, super thin. You're going to wish you had left that keel. Because the keel is very easy to reduce, you can always go back at the very end and very cleanly dress up the keel and get it to exactly the weight that is appropriate given your neck thickness. But doing it at this stage is too early in the game because you might need it later. So I always do less on the keel, but then I do address the rest of the back of the handle. I just leave the keel a little thicker than I otherwise would. Okay. So you can use a combination of this kind of pull stroke combined with thumb push strokes to get the amount of smoothness that you want. You might not want a ton of smoothness. It just depends. All right, so at this stage, I've got like that, and zoom in so you can see the rim is fairly narrow at this stage. Everything is basically lined up. Good enough. Looks like I need to do the sides a little bit better. Get them lined up. So here you can see the benefit of having that deep keel is like as I reduce this weight here, you can see that because I have the deep keel, I don't have to be as worried. This is also why I believe you should start off with a thicker neck than you think you're going to need, because you never quite know exactly where the material of that, like you want your neck to be thin, but you don't necessarily know right at the beginning exactly where you want that material to be for it to be lined up with the bowl, etc. So leaving the neck of the spoon deliberately on the thick side is a smart move, because it allows you to adjust things to be exactly as you want them. Okay. Good. All right, good. So now everything's lined up and symmetrical. Now I'm going to run the facets down the back of the handle. Okay, it's a fairly delicate handle, so my facets are going to be on the small side. And basically, to get a rounded form, I do an initial facet, and then I kick a facet that knocks off the corner of either side of that facet. And in a very loose, organic way, I can get a nicely oval cross section. Now, obviously, I'm going to end up pushing this down a little more, but because everything is loose, it's just real easy to sort of fit everything in. All right, so you can see now I have a fairly oval cross section there. Now I'm going to do the top facets. The top facets need to taper so that they get smaller right at the end there and actually fall off in this instance. Let's see if I can keep the other one from falling off. You gotta make sure you don't overcut this one that's on the underside that you can't see. All right, so you see how those facets have to taper down so that they don't affect the curvature of the rim. Because if you keep them the same width all the way down, they're gonna dive down below where you want your rim to end up. So. It's a good idea to let them naturally taper their way out. And right in here at the neck is going to be where the grain changes. So you need to ease your way up to it. And if your knife is struggling to do this, that's a sign that your knife needs to be sharpened, particularly the tip of your knife. And then again, knock the corners off each one of those. By doing a series of loose facets like this, I find it's much more forgiving form, in that I can adjust things as needed and end up with a pleasing form and a faceted look without the sort of tyranny of exacting facets that, you know, need to be exactly right, otherwise they look wrong. Good. There we go. And my handle is done. I'm going to try do your facets in one cut to add smoothness. I think it's worth trying, Lucas. You'll notice that, like on the back, I do a facet like this, and then when my hand touches my body, I hold it there, and I finish the facet like that. So yeah, I think, you know, the more you can do with one cut, the smoother you're gonna get. And obviously, there's sort of limitations to all of that, but that's partly why I like this longer knife. Is that the longer blade gives me greater sort of running time before I reach the tip of the blade, and therefore I end up with smoother lines on my spoons. Similarly, that's why as you get your spoon more and more refined, you're able to get a smoother look, is because you're able to, with a narrower strip of wood that you're trying to cut across, right? When you're trying to cut around a rim that's narrower, it's easier to do a longer cut because it's not as powerful and difficult to cut. And so So that's why it's useful to sort of bring everything into refinement in stages, because by the time you're doing your final versions of the same cuts that you were doing at the beginning, but they're just now everything's refined, you're able to do them much more smoothly than you otherwise would have been when everything was chunkier. So yeah, I think it is worth trying for. Like anything, it's going to be something that you can build a skill in, so that you build up to being able to get exactly sort of the smooth lines that you envision. And for some people, smooth lines isn't the point, right? Like some of the coolest spoons I've seen have been these ones that JoJo has done, where she's deliberately made sort of a faceted outline on the back shoulders, which I remember thinking was just so cool. Where these back shoulders were like chink, 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 and so there were facets. So it's spoon carving is playing, and you're sort of going to be interested in different things at different points. For me, I'm more interested in the overall form than I am in sort of getting facets to flow one to the next. So, all right, now I'm going to carve a bowl. So one of the things that's interesting is this wood is relatively fresh compared to the well, no, I guess it's the same piece of wood. It's just the sapwood behaves differently than the heartwood, and so as I'm going from the sapwood to the heartwood, you can hear how sort of squeaky it is, and that's a function of the difference in moisture content between the woods. And to some extent, this heartwood that's right up against the sapwood behaves differently than heartwood that's in the center of the log as well. So, let me see if I can put this so you can see a better view of this. How's that? Andrew, it's not going to dry out under those circumstances. What it's going to do is it's going to get moldy. So you probably have it totally depends on the log, where it was stored, how moldy it was to begin with, but you probably have a couple weeks at least, maybe a month or two in the fridge, and then it'll get moldy. But that mold will probably only be skin deep. So what I always tell people, just as a sort of one-size-fits-all thing, which is not nearly as nuanced as reality, is if you're going to carve it within a couple weeks, keep it in the fridge in a plastic bag. If you're going to carve it within a couple months, toss it in the freezer in a plastic bag. As long as it's in a plastic bag, it's not going to dry out. So the cold temperatures are just sort of damping down any fungal growth that might happen. And in general, the fungal growth that I've seen happen in the fridge is not like the internal spalting fungal growth. It's more the external growth. So spalting, I haven't seen spalting get worse from being stored in the fridge. How does the North Pack differ from the Monadnock? You have the North Pack. So the North Pack it has a tighter curve, right? So this Monadnock essentially has one continuous curve, and the North Pack would be more of a tighter curve. What that means is that you're able to get into deeper forms. The knife will want to dive deeper, so you have to be careful of that. I'd say the main thing, my main beef with it is that you do probably 80% of your cutting from here to here on the blade. And sometimes you're pivoting on the tip and making a cut like that. And sometimes you're pivoting back here and making a cut like that. Does that make sense? Um, and the nice thing about the monadnock is because this is a continuous curve, both of those cuts, this one and this one, produce. I'll get to that in a second, Andrea. So both of those cuts, this one and this one, produce the exact same curve in the wood because the curvature is the same. With the North Pack, um, thanks. With the North Pack, um, this cut will produce a shallower curve than this cut. Does that make sense? Because this cut is using the more tightly curved bit at the end. It's the difference is not extreme, and I think you'll be fine with the North Pack. It's just something you need to be aware of, right? So like as I do this cut, I'm pivoting on the tip and going around the back shoulder. So that creates one curve. Now, if I were to come back, and because I had chatter marks and was trying to clean it up from this direction, you see how I'm actually pivoting on the back and using the tip of the knife to make, pivoting on the back and using I normally put my thumb so that you can't see it, but I'll try and do it so you can see it. And you see how I'm using the tip of the knife to make that cut. Because the North Pack has the same curve, those two cuts created the same curvature in the spoon. I don't have to think to myself, oh shoot, is that a different curve that I just cut? You're going to have to think of that and just be aware of it. And to some extent, it'll mean that while you can get into smaller, deeper forms, and smaller and or deeper forms, it will mean that you're going to be leaving a few more track marks than I'm leaving in spoons, just because it's a tighter curve, tighter diameter. All right, so what if you've been carving the same spoon for a couple of weeks, and Andrea, every time you're done with the spoon, you put it in the plastic bag, you put it back in the fridge? Under those circumstances, I would say that the moisture loss that you're experiencing of it drying out is moisture loss from when you're carving it. It's going to be losing moisture as you cut across these fibers and expose these fibers to the air. They start losing moisture. All right, so that's an important test. When you put it in your mouth, I can tell I don't want to go much deeper than this. So now I need to recut my rim. So I suspect, Andrea, that if you are struggling because you feel like it's too dry, like it's still big and chunky, but it's too dry, try re-soaking it. I don't think, Sherry, it's one or the other. I think you just need to get used to your knife, right? Like you're going to get used to sort of what your knife can do. And to some extent, your style is going to develop from that. Think of like Django Reinhardt, right? The jazz guitarist. When he was a young man, he was in a fire so this is my left hand. I know it looks like my right hand. When he was a young man, he was in a fire that fused together these three fingers on his hand from the damage. He learned to play guitar, fretting the guitar, using these fingers, sort of slapping them down, rather than having the articulation of all four fingers like most guitarists. With that limitation, he developed an entirely new style of playing guitar that then people who didn't have that limitation had to learn. Like if they wanted to emulate him, they had to learn how to do this thing that was the only thing that he could do, or was the best that he could do. So I would say, like, knife is what your knife is. Figure out what works with it and what doesn't. It's about being aware of what the knife is doing. So much of spoon carving is just about awareness. It's about being aware of the moisture content of the wood. It's being aware of how your axe is feeling. It's about being aware of how your edges are feeling. It's about being aware of what exactly cuts is your tool making and wants to make. And there's no, like, if the more you focus on sort of like, this is how I should be doing it, the less you're paying attention to that awareness. And that awareness, honestly, is everything, because all the innovation that's happened in the space has happened because somebody has been aware and hasn't just been following what other people have been saying. That he's sending you, Tom? So let me go back to Andrea. Um, if you've been carving your spoon blank, all right, so now you can see I've sweetened up the rim. Looks nice and clean from the side. Um, so if you've been carving your spoon blank, Andrea, and he hasn't, Tom, and you feel like it's dry to the point where it's actually impeding your ability to finish carving it, Andrea, you can rehydrate it. What I would do is I would try just soaking it in a bowl of hot water for a little bit and see if that helps. Um, you could, I wouldn't bother boiling it. Probably I'd just soak it in hot water for a little bit, see if that helps. Um, that's probably going to be the easiest thing for you. I won't make it more complicated than that. All right, so now I'm basically making the rim the right thickness. And what the right rim thickness is varies depending on where on the rim it is. So I have found, and I've said this many times, that a rim that varies in thickness is much easier to get looking nice than a rim that I'm trying to make the exact same thickness all the way around. Which is, I only tend to do that on my round forms because there's something about the true perfect geometry of the round forms that sort of begs to have the rims be exactly the same or close to it. And with a more egg-shaped form like this, it just feels pretty natural actually to let the rim vary in thickness. And then it's much easier to make that rim look nice because instead of having to sort of get it exactly the same thickness all the way around, all I'm trying to do is get it to have a nice looking taper from one part of the rim to the next. You're struggling in the bowl. Yeah, and I would say in the bowl, so like, first of all, you might not be choked up enough on the knife. If you're holding the knife like this, slide it down so that your finger is actually all the way on the blade. You're going to have a lot more power and it's going to be safer because it won't be able to be as close to your hand. See how much closer that is? And as soon as I slide it down, it gets further away from my thumb. How close do I braid the bowl to bring the bowl to where the handle comes in? You mean like right here at the neck? So you can see, yeah, so that's the other problem with grain. It's like right up there. So the key is to get the neck exactly how you want it, coming down in first, and then you can sneak up to it this way using a combination of swirling across the back like this. But I find when I do that, sometimes it ends up beautifully symmetrical, and sometimes it ends up lopsided because of how I'm coming across it. And so then sometimes it's helpful to just come straight down from there down into the center and sort of ease that out to the sides. So that's my sort of 1-2 combination of getting those back shoulders nice. And in general, this is one of those places, I would say, if I had to describe it, I would say that like I try and make the rim thinnest on the sides and then sort of medium in the back shoulders and thickest at the tip. And that helps keep the tip of the rim stronger, which is helpful. So another problem with grain like this is that it makes it really hard to see what the true lines are because your eye is being constantly
pulled and distracted by the grain. Which, come to think of it, might be a benefit to someone who's starting out and their lines aren't that hot to begin with. You can really sucker a customer by having the by having a tangentially oriented spoon where they just aren't paying attention to the lines. That sounds terrible, but it might be a good tip actually for somebody who's starting out spoon carving. On the other hand, you're going to end up with better results overall, I think, if you're just starting out spoon carving by doing all radial wood. So not only, I just think that's the better long-term move, is to carve radially split. All right, so now I'm blending, and you'll notice I'm blending by going with the bowl. For whatever reason, cuts in this way, you don't notice the ridges in the same way because the spoon interacts with your mouth in this direction. You're not putting the spoon to your mouth sideways. And so facets that run this way, your lips just don't feel in the same way. Whereas if all of your cuts are going across, you're creating a bunch of ridges and your mouth is going to feel it. Thank you. So, all right, so I'm blending, but then down here, I want to not get stuck. So I finish those blending cuts by then swirling across like that, and that helps me create a clean, continuous surface. Because at this point, the thing that really matters is the curvature, not so much the facets. And so you're always going to end up with a bump right in here. And this is where you got to kind of finesse and come in really gently from a couple different angles and try and make it so there's a clean surface. But honestly, like, this is always going to be the spot where there's some sort of imperfection, that back quadrant there. And you just have to sort of push as best you can to make it as perfect as you can and then walk away. All right, so the mouth test. At this stage of an eating spoon, I'm putting it in my mouth and I'm feeling for what's the overall curvature, what's the overall depth, is it going to hold enough, are there any bumps, particularly here and here, that you are going to feel. And I can actually see one spot right there. Good, and there's a corresponding spot on the other side where I just didn't sneak quite up enough to that rim that I established. Good. 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 Okay. Good. I like it. So now I'm going to cut a micro chamfer on the inside rim edge, and that's going to help keep this edge from being a little sharp in my mouth. Good. It's really easy for eating spoons to be too deep, particularly those of you who have tightly curved hook knives. They want to dive in deep. So, I don't think that like open sweep knives work particularly well. I think the reason people have success with them is that it tends to push people who are used to diving too deep. It keeps them from diving deep, and so they end up having success, not because the curvature of the hook knife is particularly good, but simply because it is sort of short-circuited this habit that they have of driving in too deep to try and fix problems because it won't let you go that deep. But I think just having the awareness of it is the name of the game. Okay, so now I've done my micro chamfer. It's good. It's still quite chunky on the outside, but now I have the inside exactly the way I want it, and I can tell exactly how much to remove from the outside to make it spot on perfect. So, good, good, good. Put away the hook knife and use the Sloyd one more time. So you're at your most delicate at this stage, and it's easy to blow it. At some point, I'm going to run out of time here, guys, but I'll do another live to really talk about finishing. So generally, what I do is I start in the middle and I try and feel for what the line should be. And I want it to be thickest in the middle and taper, taper, taper to the tip. The tip is widest here, but in this orientation, it tapers smoothly. It doesn't flare out on the bottom there. So now I've created my middle line. I'm going to do my other lines. Now, an important thing is that notice how I'm holding my knife. How to describe it? I am holding my knife so that instead of being like this, where the handle is in the point of my knuckles, it's tilted like that. And what that does is it means it's tilted up slightly. And that means that the default is that it will come up and out of a cut unless I'm deliberately leaning it down into it. And that is kind of an insurance policy against it diving too deep into the grain. So it wants to ride up because of the angle I'm holding it in my hand. This is the only time I hold the knife in my hand at that angle. It wants to ride up and exit out of the wood rather than dive in deep because of how I'm holding it. And that's an important feature that I've only just recently been able to articulate or even realize that I was doing. But I essentially build side-by-side facets that allow me to build down to the rim. And I adjust the curvature towards the tip by how much I lean down in, and I adjust the curvature towards the sides by how many facets I push over and how deeply I go with them. And what I found is that by doing this process where I get the spoon bowl exactly the way I want it on the inside and then I do the outside, and by having this way of holding the knife where it's not going to go deeper than I want it to, that what I found is that I'm able to go reliably much thinner than I used to go. I went through a brief period when I was just starting out of making my spoons way too thin, and they were thin in the wrong places, so they were weak. And then I went through a phase of basically making them way chunkier and stronger again. And now I'm in a phase of sort of figuring out where's the middle ground, where they're still plenty strong enough that you feel like you can use them and toss them in your bag without thinking about it, but yet they're not nearly as chunky. They're actually really sort of smooth and delicate in your mouth in the best way, and that they age well over time. And what I found is that actually when they are more delicate, they age better over time. The chunkier spoons tend to get more uncomfortable as they age, whereas the more delicate spoons I own tend to get more comfortable as they age. Okay, now I have the tip exactly the way I want it, right? And now I'm going to do these back shoulders. These back shoulders, I think it's easy to undercut them because they're a bit of a pain in the neck. You want to make sure that you're not diving into the neck, and you want to blend, right? There's this grain change that happens here, right here on the back. So you want to sort of blend gently so that you end up without a harsh transition from one to the other. You could go for a harsh transition, but you're less likely to end up with the right amount of delicacy with a harsh transition because you're going to be prioritizing the symmetry of that stark line that you're creating over, is this exactly the right thickness? See what I'm saying? Ha! Thanks, Andrea. So there's